Hey, Larken Rose here, and from the vantage point of voluntarists and anarchists, to use the scary word, it is easy and tempting to be very judgmental of statists for the evil authoritarian crap they condone, which I am on a regular basis. There is, however, a factor that I think needs to be included, and I'm going to start with a random reference to something seemingly unrelated. In Frederick Douglass's autobiography, or the things he wrote about his life as a slave, one of the most profound to me was he described early on one of his masters, the master's wife, was this sweet lady, like teaching him to read and being nice and treating him like a human being when he was younger. And he thought that was awesome. Now, keep in mind, already most of the slaves thought the institution of slavery was, well, that's just how things are. They thought it was legitimate. And it's easy from our perspective to assume that they all recognize, no, they must have all known that slavery was profoundly evil. No, they didn't, because they were raised like livestock, which is profoundly evil, but they were raised to think that this is legitimate, this is okay, they're obligated to serve their master because they're the rightful property of their master. That's what they were taught. And of course, the progression that Frederick Douglass went to figure out the insanity of that, to free his own mind from that, is impressive enough. But one of the things that was so amazing to me is him describing how this sweet lady who taught him to read and everything then had her husband talk to her. And basically, as far as he could tell, the husband said, you can't treat them like people. You can't be nice to them like that. Don't be teaching them to read. And I think there's even a quote about like a slave that can read isn't going to be a good slave, which is profound in so many ways, because if you can read, you can like explore different thoughts and think about things. What a coincidence that our education system does such a crappy job of A, teaching people to read, and B, teaching people to think critically. Setting that aside for a moment, Frederick Douglass described how this sweet lady suddenly wasn't sweet, and obviously her husband had given her a talking to about you can't treat them like that, you can't talk to him like he's a person, and you certainly can't teach him to read. And so a normal person going through that experience would say, oh, she turned into this nasty witch. She was sweet before, and now she's just this evil nightmare. What a jerk. Like, that's a natural response for most people to have. Frederick Douglass instead recognized, wow, the institution of slavery destroyed the soul of this sweet woman. Not a woman slave, a slave owner. And recognized the damage and destruction that it did to the human soul for somebody to think and act as if they have the right to dominate somebody else. That doesn't just victimize and harm the one being dominated, it victimizes the dominator. And so the reason I bring that up in the context of the question that I started with is, once somebody believes that the state is legitimate, and that legal violence is legitimate and valid, and it's the law, so it's okay to advocate that your neighbors be forcibly dominated and controlled and forcibly robbed by way of taxes, as long as it's done through the legislative process, because then it's legal, it's legitimate, it's the law. Then if they disobey, they're the bad ones, they're the criminals, they're the tax evaders, they're the nasty subjects who didn't go along with it. And what it does to the human soul to convince somebody that they have permission to abuse somebody else is exactly what Frederick Douglass described. Now, in the case of most statists, they're not doing the abuse directly. Now, the ones who do that directly, the soldiers and cops and tax collectors and bureaucrats, yes, it rots their souls and turns them into monsters too. Incidentally, if you've ever read my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, it gets into the effects of the belief on authority on all sorts of different categories of people, not just the victims of authoritarianism, like the negative effects on those people are kind of obvious. They get victimized and robbed and stomped on and terrorized and occasionally murdered. But the lawmakers and the law enforcers and the voters and the people who believe this, all of them have their souls like irreparably damaged. Well, maybe not irreparably. They can recover, and I know lots of people who have, but it's a hard road because once you've gotten into the mindset of thinking it's okay to abuse and dominate and violently control your neighbor, as long as you do it by way of the thing called politics, it kind of messes with your head, and you definitely then don't want to admit, wow, I was cheering for something evil. So statists have a psychological investment in thinking that the political beliefs and policies and laws and crap they supported before was legitimate and righteous, because for them to question that and for them to consider otherwise requires them to consider, wait, was I a cheerleader for evil? So they cling to it. They cling to their statism, and they feel not only righteous about abusing others by way of the political process, but they resent the victims and they blame the victims. And you can see countless conservatives do this in comments under videos of police abuse. Well, if you just complied, if you just did what you said, if you did what the masses said, overseer wouldn't have had to whip you. Well, on a practical level, that's true. Also, if you think that makes the victim of the whipping the bad guy, you're screwed up. And the vast majority of conservatives are screwed up. And I was, when I was one, a zillion years ago. I was screwed up because I believed using government force to dominate and rob my neighbors, just for certain things, just in a limited way, just for good things that are good for society. As long as I thought that was legitimate, I was a cheerleader for evil, and I would blame the victims of the authoritarian aggression. Well, you didn't go along with this legitimate violent aggression, so I hate you for being victimized. And that's what actually happens. And this ties into so many situations where somebody has power over somebody else and who sort of delights in that power and enjoys dominating others. I mean, you can see that in 8 zillion different police abuse videos where you can tell they're getting their rocks off, abusing some unarmed person who's not even fighting back. And the thing is, it's easy to think, well, a bunch of evil bastards signed up for that job so they could do exactly this. And that's true to some extent. The thing is, even not quite so evil, or maybe not even at all evil people who sign up, as soon as they become convinced that they have the right to forcibly dominate others and control them, they are trained to think that as soon as they show up at any scene, they're in charge, and the first thing is gain control. Tell everybody where to go and what to do, and anybody who disobeys you is bad because you're law enforcement. They are trained to look down on other people. They are trained to view others as beneath themselves. Just like sweet lady who taught Frederick Douglass to read, and then her husband told her, you can't treat them like people. You have to treat them like inferiors. And the moment a human being is convinced that he should treat others like inferiors, first of all, he's going to. He's not going to be nice. He's not going to be a decent human being. Second of all, his soul is going to start to rot. And one of the obvious symptoms of that is going to be he's going to resent his victims. And you can see that all over the place because something inside him knows this isn't okay. This is weird. I'm bossing people around and threatening them with stuff. I don't even know these people. Like, I show up on a scene where I don't know what happened and I don't know what's going on, and the first thing I do is boss everybody around and threaten everybody who doesn't immediately do whatever I say. there are only two options, because if they have a soul at all, or start to question it and go, okay, maybe I shouldn't boss people. Maybe I should find out what's going on. Maybe I should treat these other people, like I'm just one of the people trying to figure out what's going on and what to do about it. Well, you can't do that and keep being a cop. Your job requires you to be a condescending control freak asshole. It is literally part of the job, because if you show up at a scene and you don't immediately claim authority and try to control everything and tell people what to do and where to go, you're not being a cop. And if you don't mindlessly enforce the will of the ruling class on anyone and everyone, you're not being a cop. And the other choice is try to convince yourself that your victims deserve it. And that's why it comes out as this sadistic, power-happy asshole trip. Stop resisting, when somebody hasn't done anything. Like, I'm arresting you for resisting arrest. Yeah, but what was the arrest for? You can't resist arrest if there wasn't already an arrest. And the mentality they have to have, and the psychology they're going to fall into, is abusive assholes who blame their victims. And exactly, like, it's 0% surprising to me that the rate of domestic abuse among law enforcers is like really damn high, 40-something%, way higher than the general population. Because they're trained to talk down to and other people and make them submit and make them obey, and then to abuse them if they don't. That is the job of a law enforcer, to make people obey the random arbitrary dictates of a political ruling class and to hurt them if they don't. That is what the job is. And if day in and day out, your job is to abuse people and treat them like crap and then blame them if they resist and don't make us hurt you. What, by minding my own business, I made you hurt me? That's a twisted, deranged thing. If you have that view day after day, and then you go home after a hard, long day of abusing and harassing and robbing people, and you come home to your wife, how do you think you're going to treat her? You just spent the entire day practicing being a dominating, inconsiderate, inhuman monster. And then you come home. If she disagrees at all or doesn't immediately do what you said, well, you've been trained for many, many hours to be abusive and violent towards anyone who doesn't immediately do as they say, or even anybody who shows you attitude. So if your wife talks back to you as if she's a person and you're a person, you'll probably react like a violent thug, just like you do when you're in uniform harassing somebody, and that somebody talks to you not like a god, not like one of the king's guards, but like a person. And you get all uppity, and you view that as attitude because one of the slaves didn't grovel before you. And then you blame your victim. So it's a psychological pattern that's going to happen anytime somebody is convinced you have the right to abuse these other people. And you can see that in cultural things and in wars and all sorts of things. When a people have been trained to think, yeah, the other side, they're inhuman and nasty and horrible. You know, you can use it used to be easier before there was the internet and people could look things up. But like in the Vietnam War, some of the heinously evil things that U.S. troops did, including to civilians over there, well, how much propaganda was thrown into training them to think that the gooks are just these inhuman, violent, horrible, it doesn't matter what you do. Whatever you do to them, they deserve it. And then you're over there shooting at people you don't know and blowing up villages and stuff. Your psyche requires you to either go, ugh, I'm the bad guy, I'm evil, I quit, I'm leaving, which a few of them did, or blame your victim and try to convince yourself that you're the good guy. And then this sadistic crap comes out. My book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, talks about that too, of why the abuse won't even just be limited to legal abuse. And in the military, it won't just be limited to mindlessly following orders and hurting people. It becomes sadistic because the human mind has to convince itself that the victims deserve it. So then it turns into torture and all sort of heinous war crimes all over the place. And that happens constantly in like both sides of almost every conflict, because ruling classes have to deceive their pawns into thinking the other side is inhuman. Whether it's the Japs or the Gooks or the Krauts or the dehumanized group that today we're allowed to beat up on, like illegal aliens. They're not really human. You should delight in their suffering because they deserved it, because authority said they weren't supposed to do something, or authority said they're the bad guy, they're the enemy. So all these people out there advocating fascist garbage in whatever context, immigration, war, tax collection, the war on drugs, literally any stupid law you can think of with a victimless crime that is not an actual crime. All that arbitrary garbage, everybody advocating that has to convince themselves that the victims of that authoritarian abuse deserve it and are horrible, bad people deserving of the suffering they're receiving, because the person who votes for that has to convince himself of that, or he has to change his mind and stop voting for that. Now, I know for myself and many thousands of voluntarists I know, it was an uncomfortable, hard position or process to go through to realize I was a cheerleader for evil. I wasn't trying to be. I just believed, as everyone around me believed, that if you use violent aggression by way of voting for a government to do it, well, then it's law. And then the ones disobeying, they're the criminals. They're the scofflaw malcontents. Well, they deserve it. And now I watch all the pathetic, spineless, bootlicking conservatives who constantly do that under all sorts of videos of whether it's people being violently kidnapped in the middle of the day in the land of the free because they don't have the written permission of politicians to be somewhere. Well, you shouldn't come here legally. Blame the victim, cheer for immoral violence, and then make yourself into a monster because you don't want to question your crappy beliefs. And as someone who went through the uncomfortable process of questioning my crappy beliefs, I can say it's not fun. It's not easy. I don't like looking back and going, yeah, I was going rah, rah, rah for people to be forced by way of taxation to fund the big monstrous imperialist military that at the time I thought was spreading democracy and freedom. I was young and I was stupid. But I was a cheerleader for evil. And when I heard of people being victimized by the stupid authoritarian crap I believed in, I wanted them to be the bad guy. I wanted them to deserve it. I wanted to believe that, which made me a way worse human being, because the only other choice is letting go of past beliefs and becoming a voluntarist. And so the point of this whole tirade is, when you look at some cheerleader for statist evil, keep in mind the belief in authority has warped their brain. There's a very high chance that on their own in a free society, they would not be these obnoxious, power-happy, violent bastards cheering for the victimization of others and then blaming the victims. They got to that mentality by way of statist indoctrination, and now they feel like they have to psychologically double down, and it makes them show up as like way more vicious, sadistic assholes than they would have been if they were never trained to be statist. And that's true of conservatives, and it's true of liberals, and it's true of literally everybody who believes in government. It makes them into worse assholes than they would have been without that. So kind of keep that in mind when judging them and trying to gauge how good or bad is this person. Because keep in mind, just like the sweet lady who taught Frederick Douglass to read turned into a monster because she was convinced you have to treat them like subordinates and slaves, anybody who has been convinced that by voting or advocating some political or legislative agenda, it's okay to violently dominate your neighbors, they have to, a little bit at least, turn into monsters, justifying the evil violence they cheer for, and that requires them to blame the victims. And if that's when you see them, you get that little glimpse of them in day-to-day life, it's completely understandable to think this person is an immoral, evil piece of crap. And maybe they are. And on a practical level, yeah, they're advocating evil. But keep in mind, they didn't come up with it on their own. The vast majority of people are made way worse by the authoritarian crap they've been taught to believe. And to me, the damage done by being on the receiving end of authoritarianism, like they robbed me blind and put me in a cage for a year. Yeah, that did some damage, did some financial damage I still haven't recovered from. I would rather go through that than go through a year of being a violent enforcer for them and having my soul demolished. I'd rather my finances be demolished and be put in a cage and still understand freedom and still understand morality than have my soul destroyed by being convinced to cheer for the authoritarian victimization and abuse of others and then blaming the victims of that. Because that is way, way more destructive. That's not just finances and inconvenience, and that is your soul being demolished. And the belief in government and political authority, to one degree or another, absolutely rots away and destroys the soul of every human being it touches.